Okay, welcome back to this next installment of the Blackbird. And today we're going to be focusing on the feet and the branch that the Blackbird is perched upon. Thank you for @DT Nature Photography for the reference photo that we're working from. And now if we just go through the materials, I'm going to be using a Faber-Castell 0.5 mechanical pencil with what I think is an HB lead, and I'm using that to just map out right now where the moss is on the branch, as opposed to where the stripped back bare part of the branch is. Okay, first thing we have to point out is that when we do the leg of a bird, there is a dividing line on the leg, a little crease that is visible. If we look at the width of the leg, it's almost 2/3 to 1/3. So where that section is, there is a crease, a very noticeable crease that makes a distinction between the scaled part of the leg and the skin texture, which is a bit like blistered or rough skin, almost like a bubble wrap that's been popped and burst in places. So as you travel from the foot up to the body, the scales on the leg lengthen out and widen out a little bit more. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and just shade in simple rectangular shapes. And this is on the 2/3 portion where the scales are, and the scales sort of indicate that the birds are derived from reptiles, so they have this scaly skin, and they've also got rough texture like you often see on lizard skin. So I'm just gently mapping out little rectangles, and they are separated. I'm leaving a little gap as I'm travelling from the top of the leg down towards the ankle, where it widens and the toes divide out from. I'm making these discrete rectangles slightly smaller, more tightly packed together, but also more horizontal in nature. Right now on the diagonal I'm doing long rectangles, but as I proceed down towards this ankle joint, these rectangles will widen out and become more kind of horizontal in nature. So as you can see, the frequency is increasing, so there's more of them, and they are kind of widening out, becoming more horizontal as we travel towards the ankle. There. So again, just tentatively using the pencil to map out these shapes. We'll come back and rework them. So the scaliness of the bird's leg means that the outer kind of contour is more bumpy, and it's also staggered. It's a little bit like if you stack cups inside each other. So the scales kind of overlap, and there's a kind of noticeable dip within them. But if I go onto the left leg now, the one that's nearer the photographer or nearer the viewer, again starting where the leg joins the body, I'm just shading rectangular shapes. I'm not worried about them being so mathematically precise because, well, they wouldn't be. But again, making sure that they're discrete, they're separate from each other. But as we proceed down the leg, they're becoming shorter, more square-like, and then eventually flatten out into these horizontals. So if you just zoom in on the reference photo, then you can see this detailing that I'm mentioning. So I'm doing sort of a shading motion, and sometimes you know, to fill out the shape that I'm making, small circular motions. But I'm noticing that the graphite on the leads does you know, glide smoothly onto this nice sea whites Bristol board surface, which is quite smooth. Okay, so we're towards the ankle, and now addressing the contours of the scales. Just trying to make sure that they're a little bit closer together. So, but here I'm going to demonstrate this kind of cup within a cup idea, that the scales overlap each other like tiles on the roof, and where they do, there is a kind of dip and then a recovery. So from the side there's a little drop, and then as we continue out, it kind of widens out here, and then drops again, and then onto the next scale. So that's an exaggerated version, you know, the cup within a cup idea, but it does give the idea that, you know, the scales are sort of tiled upon it, upon the skin, and they do in outline give this kind of slight offset staggering. The cup idea is ideal for, you know, drawing insect legs. Now I got the feeling that these tones were a little bit abrupt with the graphite on the white surface, so what I'm doing now is using a tortillon, a torchon, or a blending stump to kind of make a gentle transition between the discrete scales and the tonality of the legs. So having done that, I now feel it's necessary to reinstate some of the tones of the you know, the tiled scales that I built in. This is just quickly going over it again, just reinstating them. And then soon we'll have to address the toes as we travel from the, you know, the bird's toenail again upwards and back towards the widened ankle. But all I'm doing is shading within the rectangle that I've made previously, and perhaps even might even need to reinstate that kind of well, I'm calling it a midline, but it's offset. So a little groove that you can see on the leg, but not doing it in a, you know, a continuous way, but in a broken way to give that kind of natural look, that natural kind of effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to alter the direction so that I can redraw the contour line, because it's gotten lost a little bit with the work. So, but also to put in that kind of staged and staggered scaled effect that I was mentioning earlier. So all I'm doing now is where those discrete gaps were between the scales that I left, I'm just doing a little bit of darkening there so that the leading edge of the scale is more noticeable, more discernible, and so it makes it easier to look at and understand, and I call that legibility. So it's a little bit more legible to the viewer. They can look at it and understand that a little bit better. What I'm also trying to do right now is make sure that the tones are right between the bird and the legs. So we don't want to go too dark on this part. So just making sure that the scales are defined before we move on to the kind of rougher skin on the other portion of the leg. So even the colour of the scales are not uniform along the length of the bird. There's a bit of variation and variety, so what I want to do is not get into a pattern and make anything too mathematical or such like. Again, reinstating the other contour, the other outline. So from reading from across the thickness of the leg, 2/3 for the scales and about 1/3 for the textured skin. So I'm just using dots and small kind of staccato marks to make that kind of blistered or burst bubble wrap kind of look. So just using small dots and little circles. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not being too, mathematically precise with it. I want it to be random and a little bit more natural and organic in appearance. So, but at the same time being aware that I can't make an exact copy of the photograph. I just want to be inspired by the details that I see, not slavishly or mechanically trying to copy every single part. So just a little bit of shading where the leg joins the body to try and give it volume and contouring, but also put in some textures on that and the wing that's behind to make it more coherent with the rest of the bird. It's got to look as if it's part of it. So now it's time to tackle the toes in a similar manner, but instead of working from the top down towards the ankle, we're going to work from the toe back towards the widened area of the ankle. So in doing the claw or the talon, excuse me, I'm basically doing the outline first, but leaving a little gap in the center so that I can vary the tone and try and give the illusion of, you know, volume and 3D effect even on this particular toenail. So by working from the contour out the way, or sorry, rather inward, it sort of builds in a little highlight. I also need to re-establish the drawing where the bird's foot actually joins the branch. It needs to be redefined, as does the second toe, which is foreshortened as it appears on the branch. So with the scaling, I'm going to work in the opposite way, work from, you know, the very smallest of the scales and lengthening as it approaches towards the widest part of the ankle. So instead of working from the top down, we're now working from closer to the bottom of the page and back up towards the ankle. But the principle is still the same, is that the kind of shorter near the extremities and widening out towards the ankle, but in the opposite direction. So little horizontal strokes. Not worried about making them perfect rectangles or things. If you look closely at the reference photo, you can see that there's a variety of shapes even within the scales. But the idea is the same, so basically it's repeating the same process. But this is just you know, a formula that is worked out to try and give the illusion of the texture of the skin and scaling of the feet. So here showing that the ankle part is the widest part, and where the fingers radiate out from our palm, in the same way the toes radiate out from the ankle, or the widest part of the bird's foot. Okay, now just trying to reinstate that kind of irregular, scaly, tiled contour on the toe. Now, one of the things that makes the foot less legible is the fact that a lot of the toe is actually obscured, where the moss of the branch kind of intermingles with the bird's feet. So here working on the toe, which is sort of foreshortened as it looks towards, you know, the viewer. Again, leaving a highlight in the center by working on the contour first and then working inward and changing the pressure of the pencil to create variations in tone from dark graphite to lighter within this lead, which I think is HB. Okay. And again, travelling towards the ankle, lengthening the shading for the scales until we reach the point where they all join up. Again, some dots and dashes to create the blistered texture of the skin, kind of rough scaling, spots and dots on the underside of the foot. So again, just trying to re-establish the outline, the contour, and again trying to vary the pressure of the pencil to create visual interest within the line, but also accuracy within the drawing. And so now on to the bird's right foot, which we see on the left, which is slightly more problematic in that it's even more obscured by the moss. But here all I'm doing is mapping out the volume of those toes by just using shading to create a couple of grey areas, and then using that as an indication of the volume of the foot to create the line drawing for the details of the foot. But again, we have a problem in that we have the texture of the foot not clashing, but interfering with the texture of the moss. So we'll have to make sure that these are drawn differently so that the eye can make a distinction between the two texture types, and the eye is very sensitive and is able to do this. But to do it, we have to make sure that we make a distinction between different types of mark making for different kinds of effects. Here I'm just kind of strengthening the tone on the scaling that I've done so far. 0.5. One of the virtues of having a mechanical pencil is that even as you use up the lead, the pencil doesn't change size like you do with an actual pencil. As you sharpen it, it changes length, and then you have to alter your grip accordingly, or it feels slightly different in your hand, whereas with a mechanical pencil it always feels exactly the same. So back on the toe, this time putting the scales in, again working from very tight scales near where the talon is to wider, longer scales as we approach the widest part of the ankle, what I'm calling the ankle. Where it joins just there, so now that's a little bit better, but it looks a little bit different just now because, you know, with the moss obscuring or occluding parts of the foot, it does look slightly different. It alters the kind of outline of the foot shape. So with the birds, with these kind of perching birds, passerines as are known, normally there's 3 toes forward and 1 toe behind, but because of the angle of the photo, the toes are kind of obscured onto the side, away from the viewer. So now it's time to address the mossiness of the branch, and I can see from the moss that they all seem to be growing, or there's a tendency to sort of face to the left and slightly upward. So all I'm doing is I'm creating random scribbles with this kind of diagonal, which I'm showing with the direction of the pencil. So as I'm applying them, I'm just trying to vary the mark making, even though it's a random scribble. Try to vary the mark making, leaving patches of light and patches of dark applied on this kind of diagonal stroke. All the way to the end of the picture plane, so where the edge of the final painting will be is just on the inside of the yellow tape. This is yellow frog tape, it's low tack and should peel away from the paper fairly well. So, but I can see by looking at the reference photo that there's patches of shade. There's a little tuft there, there's a little patch, a little hollow. And so by marking that in, I'm changing the tone so that when I scribble over the top of that in a moment's time, and this little diamond shape that I see, just close to the right foot of the bird, we're seeing it on our left hand side. When we scribble over the top of that, that's going to affect the mark making, the overall effect of the mark making, and it should read as a slightly darker patch. But we're going to revisit this in different types of mark making. Right now it's just a kind of random scribble. So just little small marks to respect the small details of the moss structure. So the tone can be built up by the frequency of the mark making within the space. So the more marks you make, the greater pressure you make, the longer time you spend on an area will all affect the visual interest of the area that you're working on. Now I would be fooling myself if I thought I could make an exact copy of this. I know that if I was painting I could get a good effect relatively easily, but what I'm doing is I'm sort of experimenting with mark making here, never having drawn this reference before, or having attempted the mossiness of a branch like this. So it's really a kind of learning curve, but I do know that I need to create a difference in the mark making so that that I can make a distinction between the mark making for the moss and the mark making for the scales. And later on, when we address the bare part of the branch, a different longer kind of mark making is needed. So here on the moss, it's short staccato strokes in keeping with the shape and growth of the moss and lichens on the branch. So now that we look at the overall effect, we can see light and dark patches, and we can imagine where we could increase the tonal depth to suggest that some are there's shadow areas and parts with greater depth. So again, working between the toes of the bird here, the mark making is different enough that there is a visual distinction between the mark making of the toe and that of the moss. So, but the intention for this drawing is that it is photocopied or laser copied, sealed with acrylic, and then overpainted. So when it's time to turn this drawing into a painting, it's going to be easier to distinguish the bird foot from the moss with the addition of colours and things appropriate to the moss. It's going to make it even easier to determine. So just all the way down to the picture plane there, so I don't run out time. Just going back in with some well, planning to go back in with some different kind of mark making, different quality of stroke. So now we've gone from the short staccato strokes of the moss to longer, more legato or smoother long strokes for the bared part of the branch. So when I read it, while I can see, you know, speckled texture on it, largely the growth of the branch is in these kind of long strands, and so that's my idea, to try and recreate that by changing the mark making from short staccato to these longer, smoother legato strokes, as you can see on the horizontal here. Now we're kind of presuming that the light is from this photo, the light source is above the bird. I'm seeing it to the top left of the bird, and so some shading is needed to show that the underside of the branch may be in slight shade compared with the upper part of the branch. But actually I think the light source is, from us viewing the reference photo, and the light source is high above our left shoulder, and so there's very little by way of a cast shadow of the bird onto the branch. But what I want to do is suggest this volume by strengthening the strokes there, by adding additional pressure on the pencil. And I'm noticing that the pencil is fairly responsive that way. That's one of the things that I'm liking about this new to me pencil. I'm not familiar with working with mechanical pencils. So by pressing a little bit harder, getting a darker tone, but also I will have to come back in and shade it a little bit to show the lumpiness, the bumpiness, and the general texture of the branch. But these are areas that I'll address when time comes to paint it. But there we go, shading the underside of the branch just to try and give the idea of volume. So just trying to get the curvature, so it's the roundedness of the branch. While at the same time, you know, recognizing that the blackbird itself is the star of this show. So as I'm making these lines, while I've tried to give a kind of long horizontal look at it, I'm also dividing up and breaking those lines up a little bit to add texture. And now when I revisit the moss, I'm looking for just little details here and there which I can strengthen with sort of dots this time, or kind of scribbles, inspired by the, you know, the light and shade that we can see on the moss. So not too many of them, and again not, you know, mathematically precise, trying to make sure that we respect the organic and random nature of the moss itself. But again, trying to put in variety of mark making to create this visual interest. So little shaded areas, little pockets, little hollows on the moss to, you know, try and recreate that kind of texture. But it's these kind of details that I enjoy getting lost in, which makes creativity very relaxing and therapeutic. I like getting lost in in these little details and enjoying the kind of zen-like feeling. So the new marks that I'm making, you can see, read very differently from the random scribble which was first applied. But if I add a dot like this, you can see, well, I hope you can see, if we put in a dot, it's a very distinct and noticeable shape. It's very, very easy for the eye to discern that. So by making, you know, different types of stroke and layering them on top of each other, you can build up a fairly plausible, fairly convincing texture of something which, you know, close up is almost impossibly detailed. We can approximate it. So, working all the way out. So you'll notice that in my drawing, I've kind of zoomed in a little bit. I felt it was necessary to make the bird more of the star of the show. And now just reinforcing by shading some of the areas that I picked out before. And when I come to glaze this with acrylic or a combination of acrylic and oil, then that'll come up. Now I'm using the blending stump here to kind of unify the mark making a little bit more. So it's just by blending a little bit we can take away some of the kind of white gaps that we've left and create a kind of coherent image. And actually it'll be my intention at the next installment of this to you know, do something different with the Blackbird as well. You know, by blending, try and kind of unify the different kinds of stroke that I've made to build up the Blackbird. The texture on the Blackbird is quite quilty, and so similarly with the moss as well, I want to kind of unify it a little bit more and kind of average out the tonality. And if some details are lost, we can overdraw it again, and that builds up greater layers of complexity. So also if the tone becomes too dark, we can go back in with you know, a pencil eraser like the mono Tombow mono eraser that I've got, or maybe even more stronger and more abrasive marks with an electric eraser. So but with the branch or the exposed pith of the branch, so longer flowing strokes can be, you know, lifted out. And every time you use a rubber, very quickly tidy up, because rubbers leave residue. I've heard described as rubber poop, so it's always a good idea to clean these up, because you can get unwanted mark making, which is difficult to remove. So as far as today goes, I think that's that for this session. It's sufficient as a first pass of graphite for the bird and for the branch. If we look at the bokeh, B-O-K-E-H, I think, bokeh in the background, we have a kind of a blurred but smoother effect. So whereas I've been conscious to build in detail and texture, the background has to contrast this by being, you know, flatter. It is textured, and we can see lights and dark patches, but the graphite, maybe graphite powder, would be necessary to, you know, coat that surface and then move on with the darker colours, like the pencils that we've got in 2B and 4B, to bring in our darkest darks before we lift out our lightest lights and bring the drawing to a close. For instance, there's a patch here under the eye or on the cheek which I feel needs lightened a little bit, so again just sweeping up that area. A couple more passes with 2B and 4B, and then some final eraser work, I think, will bring this work to a close. So again, just reiterating here that we need to build in a contrast between the background of the bird. It does look a little bit stark, the bird and the branch on this white surface. So we need to use something like create a color graphite powder to coat over that area, creating the dark and the light patches, but in a smooth way, and whereby it contrasts with the textures and mark making of the bird. So we'll just bring this to a close. A little reminder, thank you at DT Nature Photography for the reference photo, and thank you for watching this episode with me.